It was the 9th of October 2006 when the Club of Nuclear Armed States received its newest member. That morning, North Korea detonated a primitive device in its hinterland to signal to the world that Pyongyang finally had the bomb. Since that day, almost 20 years ago, no other nation on Earth has crossed the nuclear threshold. Remarkably, the group of states in possession of nukes remains steady at 9. The US, Russia, the UK, France, China, India, Israel, Pakistan, and North Korea. Yet that doesn't mean things will always stay this way. In fact, there are already signs that membership of this exclusive club may soon increase to 10 or more. That other nations want the bomb shouldn't be surprising. Countries as diverse as Taiwan and Iraq have pursued such weapons over the years, with one nation, South Africa, even managing to clandestinely build a small number of nukes that it later dismantled. What is unusual, though, is the sheer number of states that are now openly talking about it. Some are sworn enemies of America and the West, others are putative allies. What they have in common are the stated desire to go nuclear and the ability to do so. When talking about nations that could go nuclear, it's important to break them into two categories. Those where the conditions are right to do so, and those where they are spectacularly wrong. It's into the second grouping that most of the world's nations fall. In many cases, it'll be because they simply aren't technologically advanced enough. Libya, under Gaddafi, famously tried and failed to build a working bomb. In other cases, they'll have the tech but lack the political will. Japan, for example, has all the know-how to construct a working nuke in a short time, but is also populated by people who overwhelmingly support non-proliferation, over 70% in most surveys. As the Stimson Center wrote earlier this year, Japanese public opinion toward nuclear disarmament remains strong, even as the strategic environment deteriorates with increasing nuclear risks. But even in the rare instances where conditions are right, there's no guarantee a nuclear program will be successful. Iraq almost acquired the bomb in the early 1990s, only for American bombardments in the Gulf War to accidentally halt the program. However, that doesn't mean there are no nations in the first camp. Right now, there appear to be a very small but growing number of countries where both the technology and wider conditions are in place to go nuclear, with little any outside actors could do to stop them taking such a step. And while these countries have so far refused to cross the threshold, it would take only a quickly implemented change in policy for them to do so. Nowhere is this truer than the first nation on our list. The country most likely to acquire the bomb in the near future, and a place where the leadership doesn't have to fear public blowback for anything it does. And we're talking, of course, about Iran. That Tehran might want the bomb isn't likely to be news to anyone who is even half awake. As far back as the reign of the Shah, the country carried out research into nukes. In the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq War, Tehran invested heavily into a nuclear program out of fear that Iraq would get there first. Although this program was suspended in 2003, the technology was already highly advanced. Since then, there have been constant suspicions that the regime is ensuring that it stands on the nuclear threshold, never quite crossing, but close enough that it could do so at short notice. Hence the fears over Iran's civilian nuclear program. As The Atlantic explains, the trouble is that civil nuclear efforts can be double-purposed, meaning that even without any specific work on weaponization, Iran's nuclear advances have brought it dangerously close to producing a bomb. These were the fears that the Obama-era nuclear deal was meant to assuage. Unveiled in 2015, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action lifted sanctions in exchange for Tehran heavily cutting back its stockpiles of enriched uranium. Reuters has the details. The deal slashed Iran's stock of enriched uranium, leaving it only with a small amount enriched up to 3.67% purity, far from the roughly 90% purity that is weapons grade. The United States said at the time that a main aim was to increase the time Iran would need to produce enough fissile material for a nuclear bomb to at least a year. In 2018, though, President Trump walked away from the deal. Within a year, Tehran was back on the path toward the bomb. By the spring of 2024, the UN was reporting that Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium had risen from the 202.8 kilograms enshrined in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action to 5.5 tons. The level of enrichment has also risen to 60% purity, only a little below what is considered weapons grade. To quote The Atlantic again, Iran is the only non-nuclear weapon state in the world to have enriched uranium to such levels. At this stage you might be wondering, well, hold on a moment. Didn't the Iranian people recently elect a moderate president who supported returning to the nuclear deal? Surely that means the worries over an Iranian bomb have faded, right? Well, the trouble is that while Masoud Pezeshkian really did campaign as a moderate on this issue, the reality of the Iranian system means that the decision to go nuclear won't rest with him. Here's the Council on Foreign Relations to pour cold water on all our hopes, quoting, "The position of the Iranian regime has been that because the United States left the agreement and imposed sanctions on Iran, Washington has to come back in compliance before talks resume." This was the position of the Hassan Rouhani and Raisi governments. It could well end up being the position of the Pezeshkian government. In other words, things may not have changed in a practical sense since May the 9th, when former Foreign Minister Qamar Karazi threatened that Iran would go nuclear if Israel ever threatened its interests. Naturally, that leads to an obvious question. How close is Iran really to developing the bomb? And the answer's more than a little terrifying. When people talk about how long it would take a country to acquire nukes, they're usually referring to breakout time, the length of time needed to produce sufficient weapons-grade uranium for a bomb. In the case of Iran, breakout time is scarily short, so short that it could literally be a matter of days. Physicist and weapons expert David Albright has written that, quote, "Today, Iran would need only about a week to produce enough for its first nuclear weapon." In the same paper, published earlier this year, he goes on to estimate that Tehran could have enough weapons-grade uranium for 6 nukes within a month. Within 5 months, there would be enough for 12. Not only that, but Albright also notes that Iran has delivery systems ready to go, including nuclear-capable missiles. Thankfully, though, this doesn't mean that Tehran could have 6 functional nuclear warheads after just a month's work. Breakout time only refers to uranium enrichment, and building a working bomb is more complex than that. You also need to go through the extremely difficult process of weaponization, a process that includes, to quote Albright again, "the mastery of the high explosive triggering system, the molding and machining of high explosives, and the building of a neutron initiator that starts the chain reaction at just the right moment to create a nuclear explosion, etc." It's here that Iran would face its main hurdle. While it should be one that the Islamic Republic can clear, it wouldn't do so easily. Back in 2023, before his retirement, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, estimated that the weaponization process would take several months. Other expert assessments have estimated as long as a year. Obviously, Iran needing as little as several months to produce a working nuke is not ideal. However, it's not quite as terrifying as the breakout time would seem to imply. In fact, it may be even less scary than you'd assume. To return to David Albright's paper again, he notes that Iran getting into a position where it can serially produce annually many warheads suitable for delivery by ballistic missiles could take a few years, and almost certainly couldn't be done in secrecy. If Iran was to try and become a serious nuclear player, we would know about it long in advance. The bad news is that Iran doesn't necessarily need multiple warheads that can be delivered by missile to achieve its goals. Simply throwing together a handful of crude nukes and detonating one at a test site might be enough to show its enemies that Tehran is serious. And the assembly time for a crude nuclear device is far, far shorter, like in the region of 6 months. Given that Iran could hold off enriching its uranium to suitable levels until the process is far along, Albright reckons that the international community might get as little as 2 months' notice that Tehran had decided to go nuclear. That's not long to act, but it's also not nothing. Were the alert to suddenly go out across intelligence agencies, you'd expect the United States to react harshly. Israel could go even further, perhaps even unleashing a kinetic response, a fancy way of saying bomb the out of Iran's facilities. But with Iranian nuclear production dispersed, it might take more than a few missile attacks to dislodge Tehran from its course. Although things might be delayed, the end result could still be Iran testing a crude device only a little later than originally planned. Given all that, now seems like a good time to wonder why, if it's so close to the bomb, Iran has never taken the final step. Why hasn't it joined the nuclear club? The most obvious answer is that the regime is afraid. As foreign policy summed up, Tehran may be deterred by the threat of preventative war. But there are also other reasons why Iran may not go nuclear, some of which could suggest that it has no immediate plans to do so. Analyst Karim Sadjapur has said that Iran may be pursuing the Japan option, meaning it gets to the point where it could make a bomb in next to no time, but refrains from doing so. In Iran's case, to keep the threat viable without inviting retaliation. Others have pointed to Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's fatwa against the use of nukes, suggesting that he may truly believe they are un-Islamic, as unlikely as that seems. Or it could simply be that Tehran currently sees no need to go nuclear, as it doesn't believe the US or Israel pose an existential threat. Whatever the reason, there's clearly something so far stopping Iran from becoming the 10th member of the nuclear weapons club. But Iran isn't the only nation currently dithering near the nuclear threshold. It's time for us to turn our eye away from one of America's greatest foes and towards one of its greatest friends, South Korea. On the face of it, South Korea would seem an unlikely contender to join the nuclear club. Despite having an aggressive, militaristic northern neighbor, it is protected by an alliance with the most powerful nation on Earth, an alliance that commits Washington to a kinetic response if South Korea is attacked. As a further precaution, tens of thousands of US troops are stationed in the country, right near the border with North Korea. Were Pyongyang to attack, so many Americans would be killed that Uncle Sam would have no choice but to respond with force. All of which is why Seoul has so far been content to stay out of the nuclear club. Apart from a brief attempt in the 1970s, the country has never pursued nukes. At least until now, because the last couple of years have seen significant shifts in Korean thinking about the bomb. Polls now show that between 70 and 80% of Koreans want their country to have nuclear weapons. In January 2023, President Yoon Suk-yeol even said that South Korea could, quote, acquire our own nukes if the situation gets worse. It would not take long. Although he later rode back his comments, that he said them at all shows how profoundly Seoul's perspective is changing on the issue. A change driven by recent developments in two specific nations, North Korea and the United States. So let's start with the changes in the USA. Like many American allies, Seoul is more than a little worried about the potential return of Trump as president. During his first term, President Trump not only questioned the need for joint military exercises between the US and South Korea, but he also insisted Seoul pay billions of additional dollars to keep US bases open on its soil. This kind of transactional politics alone would be enough to give Koreans the jitters. But they also coincided with Pyongyang making a series of technological breakthroughs. These breakthroughs revolved around developing missiles capable of delivering nuclear warheads to US territory. Initially, possible targets were limited to places like Guam and Hawaii. Today, though, the Hwasong-18 is thought to be capable of striking the US mainland. For Seoul, this has been a strategic game changer. Beforehand, South Korea could be fairly sure America would protect it against a North Korean invasion, despite the likely loss of tens of thousands of US service members in the fighting. Now, though, there are worries that the White House would be unwilling to trade Seattle for Seoul, or as AP News put it, the fear is this, that a US president would hesitate to use nuclear weapons to defend the South from a North Korean attack, knowing that Pyongyang could kill millions of Americans with atomic retaliation. Another factor that has exacerbated these worries has been the Ukraine war. American allies in Asia have watched this conflict with growing concern. One of the main takeaways in Seoul has been Western hesitancy to stand up to nuclear-armed Russia. If friendly nations are scared of a relatively regional autocrat like Putin using nukes, the thinking goes, how would they react to a genuine madman like Kim Jong-un threatening to deploy them? The Biden White House tried to calm these worries, signing a document on joint nuclear deterrence on July the 11th. But if Trump returns, that document could be almost worthless. These, then, are the strategic calculations Seoul is mulling as it signals its openness to nuclear weapons. Calculations perhaps best summed up by the former head of South Korea's Special Forces, who earlier this year told the Financial Times, "I have never doubted an American soldier, but I would be foolish to place my nation's security in the hands of an American politician." And while we can't pretend to know which way Seoul will ultimately go on the issue, we can at least now ask an important question. Could the South Koreans actually do it? Going nuclear is unlikely to be a decision South Korea would take lightly. Unlike its northern neighbor or Iran, it's not a pariah state, already cut off from most of the world's economy, and the penalties for breaking the non-proliferation treaty could be harsh. The diplomat notes that sanctions could be slapped on Seoul by the UN as punishment. The United States would also react harshly, perhaps depriving the Koreans of one of their key allies. There would be worries too about the reaction from Seoul's neighbors. At the lower end of the scale, local frenemy Japan might be convinced to also go nuclear were South Korea to detonate a device. At the higher end, Beijing might get involved. As the diplomat writes, Seoul would also face China's reaction to its nuclear development, further increasing the pressure on South Korean security. Given all these possible downsides then, Seoul would want to make sure of a few things before embarking on the race for the bomb. One is that the security guarantees it brought would be worth the risk. In other words, it would have to seriously look like the Americans were losing interest in the region. Since containing China's rise is a bipartisan goal in Congress right now, and South Korea is a key part of that strategy, it's difficult to imagine such a thing coming to pass, no matter how much Trump might grumble about the cost of maintaining US bases on the peninsula. But still, let's imagine for a moment a world where the United States turns so isolationist that Seoul is right to fear abandonment. If that happens, would South Korea have the ability to get the bomb? On a technical level, the answer is a firm yes. As the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace think tank has written, South Korea boasts one of the world's most advanced civil nuclear energy enterprises, along with conventional strike and space launch capabilities that could be converted into nuclear delivery systems. South Korea certainly has the technical capacity to build large enrichment or reprocessing facilities if it so desires. It's worth noting, though, the key part of that last sentence: if it so desires. Unlike Iran, South Korea does not have all the necessary infrastructure built and ready to go. While Tehran might be capable of putting together a crude device and detonating it within 6 months, Seoul would have to wait longer. Exactly how long? It's a matter of conjecture. Back in 2018, the Pulitzer Center ran a report that reached the following conclusion. It would take 2 to 3 years for South Korea to produce a nuclear bomb, including building some necessary infrastructure. Now, part of that time would be spent constructing a new reprocessing plant to make weapons-grade plutonium. There might also be issues with having enough trained personnel in the country available to, quote, build and run the back-end fuel cycle technologies required to produce the plutonium for a warhead. Once the plant was built, though, it would take just 1 year for Seoul to have enough fissile material for 20 warheads. Now, obviously, this article was written 6 years ago, so some of those estimates may be out of date, but it does suggest that South Korea would have to wait longer and invest more than Iran to carry its nuclear program all the way through to a completed device. So what's the reason that Seoul lags behind Tehran? According to the Carnegie Endowment, it's at least partially due to the fact that, quote, restrictions in US Republic of Korea nuclear cooperation agreements have prevented Seoul from moving beyond small-scale enrichment and reprocessing experiments. Still, it's clear that the nuclear option is on the table for South Korea, even if it might be tricky to overcome the political fallout. Yet Seoul isn't America's only ally that's recently flirted with nuclear rhetoric. It's time for us to travel back to the Middle East to check on a nation that's watching Iran's growing nuclear prowess with alarm: Saudi Arabia. Since at least 2018, Saudi Arabia has responded to hints that Iran might get the bomb, with rhetoric suggesting that it too could seek to build a nuclear device. Most recently, this includes comments Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman made to Fox News in September of 2023, in which he made it clear that if Iran did build a nuke, quote, we will have to get one. To be fair, MBS, as he's locally known, went on to clarify that this was an extreme scenario and that he would prefer not to go nuclear. Nonetheless, such threats have made some observers wonder if the Saudi kingdom might not be a potential candidate for acquiring the bomb, a concern that was recently turbocharged by talk of a potential nuclear deal between the Saudis and America. Driven by the Biden White House, the deal would see Riyadh agree to normalize ties with Israel in exchange for, among other things, the US building a uranium enrichment facility on Saudi territory, part of a drive by the kingdom to switch its energy supplies to cleaner sources. The trouble is that establishing such a plant could potentially give Riyadh access to nuclear technology that could be used to build the bomb. Here's how Reuters summed it up. Without rigorous safeguards built into an agreement, Saudi Arabia, which has uranium ore, could theoretically use an enrichment facility to produce highly enriched uranium, which, if purified enough, can yield fissile material for bombs. At the time of writing, the agreement hasn't yet gone ahead, and even if the White House seals the deal, it's not at all certain the enrichment facility will ever be built. As the Carnegie Endowment points out, quote, a US defense treaty requires ratification from 2/3 of the Senate. With the majority of senators from both parties skeptical about Riyadh's nuclear hopes, it seems more likely than not that such a deal would be tanked in Congress. However, it raises some interesting questions. The chief one being that if the Saudis don't yet have an advanced civilian nuclear program, how are they going to build the bomb? Well, according to the Carnegie Endowment, the simple answer is that they're not. As the think tank writes, unlike South Korea, the country has no real nuclear latency to leverage. It is still working to start a new research reactor while penning ambitious plans to import nuclear power plants and even enrich indigenous sources of uranium. The notion of the kingdom going nuclear is simply not credible. Aside from the technological gaps, the report also lists some of the political problems. Not only would the Saudis attempting to build a nuclear device cause a ferocious backlash from America, but it might also spark a war with Iran, which fears Saudi nukes almost as much as the Saudis fear Iranian ones. Laid out like that, it seems less and less likely that Riyadh might acquire the bomb, at least in the near future. And that begs the question, why then do Saudi officials keep hinting at it? And the most likely answer seems to be that it provides them leverage. On the one hand, it acts as a warning shot at Iran, a reminder to Tehran that going nuclear could lead to unintended regional consequences. On the other hand, it also acts as a pressure point Riyadh can apply in its relationship with the United States, a way of trying to coerce Washington into doing things like increasing defense cooperation and investing in Saudi nuclear energy as a way of preventing proliferation in the Middle East. As such, we can probably say that Saudi Arabia is the least likely of the three countries that we've examined today to build the bomb. Although, given the kingdom's immense riches, we can't discount the idea that they might one day be inclined to seriously try. So, those are perhaps the most likely nations on Earth to be next to join the nuclear club. A foe in the Middle East, an awkward ally on its border, and a long-time ally all the way over in East Asia. Now, obviously, these are all very different countries in very different situations. Because of this, we have no way of saying for certain if any of them will ever take the final step, or whether any other nation will. But one thing is for certain. For the first time since North Korea exploded its way into the nuclear club, it's looking more and more likely that a new member may soon join. In a world of growing big power competition, nuclear weapons may be the only security guarantee left that really means anything.